Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Today, we are going to talk about India, population-wise, the largest country in the world. In ancient times, of course, India was the mythical big exporter of silk, cotton, sugar, spices, etc. And still today, it is the seventh exporter of services in the world. Its biggest trading partner is China, followed by the US, and then the European Union. In more modern time, though, India has been considered as a rather reluctant trade country, hesitant to make free trade agreements, and a complicated partner in the WTO, often having an opposite view of the large majority. But lately, we have seen India signing 13 free trade agreements with countries such as Australia, Japan, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and trade regional organizations such as ASEAN and EFTA. There are also ongoing negotiations with the United Kingdom and with the European Union. Is this a trend, a change? What is actually India's vision of trade? And how does it see the future of multilateral organization? These are some of the questions we will discuss today. You will learn everything you ever wanted to know about India and trade with my two stellar panelists. Arpita Mukherjee, professor at the Indian Council of Research of International Economic Relations, and Badri Narayanan Gopalakrishnan, founder and director of the Infinite Sum Modeling, non-resident fellow at the National Institution for Transforming India, the Government of India. You're both very welcome. So starting with you, Arpita, how would you describe briefly the overall trade vision of the Modi government?
I think that, if you look at the overall trade pattern, the current government is also trying to grapple with what is happening geopolitically and in the trade front globally. You see a lot of, disruption to trade over the last couple of years, starting from the COVID pandemic to building supply chains to geopolitical tensions. And today, as you stand here in India, you cannot kind of isolate yourself from all this trade things that is happening, other things that is impacting trade geopolitically. Having said that, one of the core things that the government has taken up and has been quite vocal on it is that they would like to trade more and look at a new FTA strategy to trade more with the export markets, right? Rather than competing among the countries which are of similar kind of endowments or from where we are importing, they would like to move into more the Western world. So you see the trade agreements with the European Union, with the UK, and to build a little bit more diversified trade with that of Australia and after. So there is a lot of initiative. Going to Mauritius was like going to Africa. Going to UAE was going to, Middle East. So they are trying new hubs and markets for trade. So there is a intention to export, strong push to export, strong push to diversify export. As you can see that India is now moving into exports of a lot of electronics and things like mobile phones. So there is a export orientation, and there is also an increasing realization that you have to be a bigger player in the value chain and be a part of the resilient value chain.
Of course, thank you so much. Badri, how do you see it? What would you like to add?
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for having me. And I just want to start with the disclaimer that my views are not that of Government of India. And I'm an honorary fellow with the government. I'm not working there full time, but I did handle a lot of India's trade policy portfolio until a few months ago. So to begin with, since your question is particularly about the current government, I would probably summarize the broad approach that India is taking to FTAs and trade policy in general is in one word, it's pragmatic. You cannot bring it under any ideological framework. So it's not like protectionism or free trade. It is more like what is best for the country's interests. Given, as Arpita rightly mentioned, given the current political and geopolitical situation globally, in a situation where even the largest developed countries are backing away from their commitments to the trade and so on. What best we can do in this environment. And also there are a lot of domestic interest, domestic polity that is involved, which is a very which makes it very difficult to open markets and expand trade ambitions of India generally. Given all that, the achievements that have been made in the recent past, they're quite big. Again, to reiterate what Arpita mentioned, we did have a long, I would say, uh, hiatus in terms of trade liberalization in India until the recent FTA negotiations the last couple of years. But before that, we had FTAs in the 90s and late early 2000s, where we had signed a few deals like Japan and ASEAN and so on. And then we didn't do many deals, and then we started. We had an EU negotiation that started a long time ago, and then that got stalled. So all this got reinvigorated with a fresh, vigor some 2, 3, 4 years ago. And that the reason was, I would say two, three. One is India wanted to reaffirm to the rest of the world that we are in the game for trade. We are pretty much open to trade, negotiating trade agreements. We have all the capabilities to do that. We have the bandwidth to do that. And that is how it started. And secondly, it was also for a long time, the Indian industry and also the policymakers had a little bit of an inhibition towards even exporting. There was even to some extent export pessimism. So why should we focus on exporting when we have such a large domestic market? This was one of the arguments that was talked upon in the industry also. That all changed with recent surge in exports the last few years. Like also Arpita mentioned, in certain products which we never thought we would export, we would even produce domestically. We started exporting a lot, like electronics, smartphones, and so on. So in 2021, we had the highest ever exports for the first time, and every year we have been breaking that record. So that gave a lot of uh, courage for India to go ahead with trade agreements. And we also realize that we have a lot of market access issues in many countries, particularly in the developed markets, where we have to sit and negotiate trade agreements. Otherwise, we cannot progress. So we identified those, and then we started going to these markets, and also, unlike the past, we started two prominent features in our recent negotiations. One is we look at complementary markets, like Arpita mentioned again. Previously, we were sort of looking at whatever agreements that happened because of various reasons. But in the recent past, we started looking at the complementary countries where we can export markets. And then secondly, we also had started negotiating on a time-bound manner, that we will finish negotiations within certain stipulated amount of period. And also thirdly, we'll focus on the low-hanging fruits first. So we also, if you take, for example, Australia, we finished one agreement, ECTA, Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, which is like full of what can be done in a short time, like what are the low-hanging fruits, and then go for a comprehensive agreement. Secondly, we also have started doing agreements with a lot of deepened trade engagements. Like we had digital trade with UAE. That's part of the discussion. We, for the very first time, we started including environmental and labor standards during the negotiations with the UK, also the EU, and so on. So the negotiation capacity has also increased by leaps and bounds in the recent years. And yeah, simultaneously, we have been working on many trade agreements, and we concluded a few of them successfully. And I think we have totally had 14 actually free trade agreements, including the recently concluded EFTA. And every trade agreement, there is something unique, apart from the fact that we have opened up a lot of our tariff lines, unlike the previous agreements. If you take EFTA, for example, we also have this investment commitments that are linked to trade. So going beyond trade, we are looking at investment. With the EU, we are also looking at investment protection, GI, and so on. So going beyond the shallow trade agreements. So that these are all about our FTAs. When it comes to WTO and other issues, we'll discuss more. But broadly speaking, India has been committed to multilateral, rules-based, transparent trade regime. So India has always been supporting the WTO. So we'll discuss more on this.
Yes, we'll come back to WTO a bit later. So what you're saying is that India is becoming a little bit more of a normal country in the way that it sees it has, of course, a huge internal market, but it also sees that trade is a geopolitical ambition to put itself there on the global arena and to export to key partners and so on. And as I said in the beginning, of course, India is also a very important exporter of services all over the world, apart from the electronics and techniques and so on. So if we look at a little more specific on this, for instance, the US is the second biggest market for India, and it has no trade agreement with the US. I think it just a couple of weeks ago signed a memorandum of understanding on critical minerals, which is, of course, the big thing that the whole world is talking about right now. And with the US elections coming up very soon, and we'll see where that goes on trade. But what could possibly come out more if you look at the Americans as a partner in trade, Arpita?
See, we are talking to the US in multiple platforms. So we have the Indo-Pacific platform where we are talking about the 4 pillars, and we have already signed on the labor and environment pillars. Of course, India has been a bit worried about looking at trade issues with the US, especially on the aspects of the digital trade and other areas. There has been some, certain areas where the approaches of the two markets are very different. Now, the point that India definitely wants to have a trade agreement. If you talk to, I'm not talking about the India, when I talk about India here, I'm not talking about the government. Government takes their decisions based on many things, geopolitics, etc. But if you talk to anybody in Indian businesses, they will go gango, oh, we need a trade agreement with the US and the European Union. Especially with the withdrawal of the GSP, it's somewhere a little bit of a need for the Indian business to secure that regime. And also the H-1B visa and the visa regime that the US offers is also it can go up and down, with the terms and conditions. And Indian IT sector specifically, they would like to secure a few things like social security agreement, a more transparent kind of a more secure visa regime with the US, where probably they would like to work on the caps and stuff like that, which can be a sensitive issue on the other side. So there are areas, and probably sometimes with the US, it looks like by many experts, and it is well written, that maybe certain low kind of like a digital trade agreement or certain specific agreements may flow better than a very, very comprehensive trade agreement. And US of late is also not looking at very comprehensive trade agreement. If you look at what US is doing, it is actually selecting an item and talking about a trade agreement. But of course, India it would like to secure itself and would like to ensure that certain policies may be targeting some other countries may not adversely impact India's export, like steel or something, into the US.
Yes, well, we might face a big wave of tariffs depending on who wins the presidential election. Do you want to add something on the US relation, Badri? I also wanted to talk about the European
Sure.
Trade and Tech Council, but you want to add something on the US?
Yeah, definitely, Cecilia. So, India's looking at the US particularly for greater market access and also other collaborations under this ICET in terms of technology collaborations and so on. And of course, right now in the US particularly, I mean, the India-US FTA also has been pending for a long time. There's some discussions going on before it was stalled and so on. And as far as what I can understand, it's the US has, because of the sensitivities and the even like a bipartisan consensus for not going forward with any market access kind of trade agreements. So that's not happening. And also GSP, like Arpita mentioned, is an important issue for India. Many sensitive industries in India have been dependent on GSP, textiles and so on, and that's something India is looking forward. But apart from these sticky areas, there has been a lot of progress in these critical and emerging technologies as ICET, and also uh, this IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, and Quad, of course. We are collaborating on that supply chain resilience initiative. So a lot of these other things, India has been quite closely working with the US, and also uh, we also have, in India, we have this production linked incentive scheme. And here we have in the US, we have this CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act. So there are also some thoughts going on both sides, as far as I know, which is to come up with some global supply chain collaborations between the two countries, taking advantage of some of these industrial policies put in place. So how US can specialize in some part of the supply chain, India can specialize in some other, and we can export to each other and build a global supply chain based on that. And that taking advantage of the domestic policies and connecting the supply chain is an important aspect between US and India. I think you also were interested in EU. Of course, India EU FTA is again a long pending thing. In fact, I remember it was there when I started my career, and it's still there. And Pita also has been involved heavily for a long time on this, and I've been involved as well. So uh, the concern about the FTA is that India has, as I mentioned, become quite advanced in terms of trade negotiation capabilities for FTAs, where we are looking at all these deep aspects of free trade agreement. We also have in some of the recent FTAs, we have had public procurement, which was like a very sensitive area. We have also discussed about that, negotiated about that. I already talked to you about environment and labor standards. Uh, all these things are important for India, and India has been open to negotiations on these things. When it comes to, particularly when you go think about greening of trade, India is definitely very ambitious, and India is taking giant strides in electric vehicles in terms of renewables, capacity of renewables, and India wants to position herself as a hub of green hydrogen globally, and even batteries. India has been ramping up the production capacity. So now, definitely, there is a huge interest in sustainability and a green transformation in India. But at the same time, we also have to think about India, despite being such a large economy and global economic power, our per capita is still less than $2,500. So you have to still you're still looking at a relatively poor developing country, which is of course growing fast, but still India cannot afford to do what EU can do or what US can do to, in terms of some of these standards and so on. And like carbon border adjustment mechanism is another thing which India is concerned about. So there are a lot of these things. So what India's point of view when it comes to these kind of trade agreements is that we want to definitely the biggest change is we want to be open, we want to negotiate all these things which were kind of taboo before. We'll never talk about these things, but now we are opening up and talking. But at the same time, we have to take into consideration the poor masses and a lot of other domestic sensitivities in these negotiations. So I think with the EU, there can be there's definitely a lot of potential and it can definitely go through. We have been seeing a lot of rounds happening of negotiations and very positive, very constructive negotiations happening. So I'm very hopeful that at some point we'll get it concluded. But there are a lot of challenges as well.
Well, indeed, and it is a big dilemma because on the one hand, you're looking, and all countries are looking for very specific solutions in the digital area or to facilitate in this specific area. But on the other hand, it all goes together: greening of trade, labor laws, rules of origin, public procurement, and so on. And that has been one of the biggest problems with the EU-India trade agreement. When I was trade commissioner, it was a long time since it started already then, and we tried to see could we find way forward, and then it was stopped, and then we started again, and now it has taken a new step forward, also within the framework of the Trade and Tech Council between Europe and India. And there was a negotiation in September, the latest one. And as you said, it is advancing. I mean, there are good discussions, constructive and friendly in one way, but still there's a big gap between what the different partners want and how far they're able to go. So what do you think, Arpita? What would be realistic to achieve in this? Because we talk about it for almost 30 years now, and still there's so much to be gained from a more formal trade agreement between Europe and India. Where is the realistic landing zone?
In any trade agreement negotiations, and I don't want to preach to the already experts, but if you want to do a deal, you do it in one day. The difference the problem is that with the European Union, see, when you do a trade agreement with a country, you get a big push for a geostrategic reason to go and sign it, and that geostrategic push is missing when you do it with the EU, because when you go to geostrategic alliances, it will be the member states doing it differently, and you kind of we also don't have a India EU desk at the Ministry of External Affairs. We have North Europe, South Europe, and so on and so forth. So the entire EU agreement is basically, actually, in the true sense, a trade agreement for economic reasons, not for geostrategic and others, because countries have their own autonomy in that area. When you look at that agreement and you go back to the time that we kind of left you to join the RCEP, probably that decision may have been a hasty and a wrong decision, because at that time what you was offering and willing to undertake was, in terms of regulatory requirements, were much simpler than what it is today. And what it is today, and if you really want to go ahead and sign on many of the dotted lines as a part of the EU requirements, it requires a substantial reform, not only on the issues under the Indian central government list, but also a number of issues under the Indian state government list. And probably that is where the India may be facing a little bit of an issue. I don't think there is a lack of intention, but you may have recently seen the problems of implementing the 4 occupational code. Like if you look at the labor standards that is talking about, the 4 occupational codes are perfectly aligned with the European requirement. Now, whether you do a trade agreement or not, European requirements are always a part of the EU directives. And now, if you look at the Environmental and Social Governance Directive, it is kind of, the directive comes, member states are given a timeline to adopt it. It is reflected in the trade agreement. So basically, what you need to do when you do a trade agreement with the European Union is that is to have a domestic reform first in place. Get a buy-in within, like you have your 28 states, they have theirs, you do an internal buy-in, get your agreements, work forward, do an agreement. I think India needs to understand that approach. And probably where while we think EU is complicated, the moment we understand that we have to have an internal synergy and then go and seal it the way the EU does. But it also has its problem. Like if you want to do a mutual recognition agreement, you have to talk to all these 28 professional bodies all over. But, that forum has to be there. And if we do that internal consultations and come to a point, EU would not be very difficult. But if you look from the EU angle, and what they want through India is that in many cases, Indian domestic regulations are fairly compliant with international norms, like we are UN Alcatraz compliant and stuff like that. However, when it comes to a trade agreement, we prefer to take soft commitments, which is will endeavor to do. And EU likes shall do. So the difference in the approach between the soft and the hard commitment kind of drives negotiators up the wall in both sides. Okay. And that is probably where we need to come to a compromise. And when you talk about tariff in the European Union is not a big problem for India. The problem is probably the market access related to certain other barriers, which some of our industry wants to be cross-traded for tariffs. Maybe the ban on dairy products may be cross-traded for lowering of tariff, and that's often is not very easily feasible by the Commission. As you know, like if you are not getting in feta cheese, Greece is not going to sign on that agreement, and if you're not getting on automobile, so this is where probably the issue lies on both sides, and many places where India really had an issue last time. For example, a uniformity in terms of labor mobility has been resolved by some of the directives, whereas new issues are coming up, and in some of these new issues, Indian industry doesn't even know what to do next. Like, for example, the ESG directive or the carbon tax and how is it going to impact is all like, we really don't know how to handle the situation or the impact of the EV regulations on us. Are we positively impacted? Is it for China or for us? So the entire system is now held kind of, I would say that 85% is done. In case of probably UK, more than 90% is done. There is a strong willingness on both sides, but always the last mile is the issue.
Yeah, that's always the case with all trade agreements. And of course, the European Union is complicated in the way that you need to involve the European Parliament and all the member states and the Commission negotiating. And then new things are added, as you mentioned, both of you, the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the deforestation and all the new green regulations that are compliant, of course, I mean, within the European Union, but also with our trading partners. And, the more you talk, the more items are added to the agenda, which makes it complicated. And therefore, I hope that the Trade and Tech Council, which is a forum to discuss these issues and to try to explain and to get accustomed with the different approaches from India, from the European Union, could be a way forward. Because you mentioned, both of you, the greening of trade, which is, of course, I mean, trade, like everybody else, has to contribute to the net zero ambitions that we all have. It will take a little bit longer for some countries and others. And somehow pricing carbon is what many countries are doing right now. The EU has maybe taken it to the most ambitious with the CBAM, but there are also other countries, and also your other trade partners are somehow pricing carbon. But I know that India has taken especially the CBAM directive to the WTO to say that it's not WTO compliant, but somehow carbon has to be part of a trade. How is this discussion going on in India? If you talk also in a more global context, trade and green, because India has a lot of very advanced green technology as well.
See, this is a very, very complicated subject in India at the moment, because when you are talking about, say, it also depends upon the sector that you are looking into. In the case of, say, you are looking at bigger sectors like steel and others, you have few players. But in India, the MSME sector, and if you go down to deforestation and the agricultural sectors, there are small farmers, multiple farmers you are sourcing from multiple farmers. So the entire system of educating the entire value chain partners, starting from the company that is the EU company which will be sourcing from India or is sourcing from India, in itself is a big issue. Now, secondly, even there is a need for, in the case of India, in many cases the nodal agencies are multiple, so the way they could do the capacity building, react to a regulation is very different. And India has always been sometimes been very different from other countries in the ASEAN. Like, I'll give you the example of tricyclozole ban. When European Union banned that, Cambodia immediately went ahead and said, okay, fine, we are going to ban it for rice, but please give us money to do capacity building. But India would go back and say, no, this is illegal. Let's talk about it and let's try to get a way out. 6 months later, there is no way out. So sometimes maybe a more collaborative approach to go back and say, okay, tell me how do I do it, is better than doing things. Now, the problem is also the WTO is almost like thanks to, although we are actually, you started your speech by saying that we kind of put WTO on the hold, but the WTO on the hold is actually with the dispute settlement being on the hold, right? The entire story is now on the hold, and that is where India hasn't much contributed. Although we think that we do a lot of things in the WTO, that's where the US has taken a lead in contributing to that. So WTO's own actions are now, people are not able to use the WTO the way they would like to use the WTO, and WTO's reform is a bigger issue rather than WTO's role in today's discussion of trade. For India, a better option that many businesses are thinking about and they're trying to learn is that how do I try to meet at a business level? The concerns are mostly, how do I try to meet the EU regulations? If I meet the EU regulations, what are my costs? And what are the real differences? Like, suppose if there is something that the EU is asking is not matching with the something that the Indian law is asking for, that's where the businesses are worried. There is a lot of worry, there is a lot of judgment, there is a lot of discussion on the subject, but having said that, there is no discussion on the subject of the need for a trade agreement with a largest trade market like the European Union. But that hasn't been because of this problem, I'll not do the trade agreement, has not been heard so far.
But you also talked about the CBAM, and it is, of course, an issue of discussion. But WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi recently said that pricing carbon is a good thing. Many countries are doing it slightly differently, but we need to avoid trade conflicts about it. So she would rather see, and she has the support from other international organizations, World Bank, IMF, OECD, and so if ideally, I know this is hard to achieve these days, but ideally there will be some sort of international supervision of how these different carbon fees or carbon taxes would be implemented in a way that it doesn't create conflict, but that it really achieves its purpose. And would India be contributing to such discussion? And are there any plans of putting carbon fees on dirty emissions as well in India?
No, these discussions are, these discussions are already in the trade platform, and there are thought processes happening that India may put in some kind of a fee, because see, basically, the India has also made certain commitments in the COP26. So it's not like India is not trying to make a commitment. India made a commitment. There are many policies and initiatives happening in India to go green. So it's there are initiatives and thought processes, but the fact remains is what they would come up with. There is need for more, I think, multi-stakeholders consultations and discussions to come out with more constructive solutions to what we can do. Because at the end of the day, there is no denial by anybody in India also that one has to look at the the situation globally and the carbon problems. But the views are of a bit of a conflict in India at certain levels, that developed countries have done their industrialization, they have benefited from whatever they wanted to do. Now that when we are at a growth stage, there are issues. We are a big country and stuff like that, and we have a lot of MSMEs, and now if it is suddenly implemented, it can be probably they wanted a more gradual process rather than a big bang kind of punishable process, and that's where there is the difference.
Badri, what's your view on this?
Just to add to what Peter said, we have, even if you look at a lot of the large companies in India, many of them have committed to net zero by 2030. So when it comes to scope 1, scope 2 emissions, we have great commitments already. And of course, the national level Prime Minister committed to like net zero by 2070. And as far as I can see, if you look at the data, emissions trajectory in the last few years, India is doing better than many other developing countries. So definitely there is a huge positive intention towards greening, environmental aspects, and so on. When it comes to CBAM, there are a lot of efforts taken by India, apart from what you mentioned with the WTO, but also we know that the time is running out. So, it's already started in 2025, 26, CBAM will be implemented. So India is already, working on an emissions trading mechanism within the country. And then the carbon tax also, there are some discussions going on. Because one of the concerns with CBAM is that yes, we definitely want to reduce emissions, we want to do that. But if the carbon tax is is same as like whatever is the carbon tax in the EU or rest of the world, if that's the same in India, and like the Indian exporters also have to pay the same, that in value terms, if you look at the prices in India and so on, it can be a huge burden. So that is why there is a lot of efforts going on now to make sure that we have some internal mechanism with this emissions trading or some carbon taxes where at least we can capture that within the country. So those are some strategies there. Again, when it comes to the success of these negotiations and keeping in mind these environmental considerations, greening and so on, I think there are two baskets or two types of issues, right? One is real issues that are really contentious and really we have to sit together, discuss and manage. And there are perception issues, right? The perception issues, I think, are kind of, I would say again, low hanging fruits, because we just have to sit together and discuss more than just what is there in the FTA negotiations, right? For example, have some confidence building measures, right? Like if the EU, instead of saying that, you have to comply with these regulations, and we have already done this, establish it, you just have to follow. If the EU says that let's sit together and discuss, let's come up with some common set of terminologies. We understand you guys are doing a lot. We want to understand that. Let's do something together, and maybe more interactions between the think tanks of the two countries, right? More interactions between the strategic partnership. I think IPEF, even G20 for that matter, despite all the difficulties there and so on, that has been a great forum where we sit together and discuss about some of these issues. To start coming up with a common terminology, we all speak the same language, kind of thing. So IPEF has been a great thing. Indo-Pacific Economic Forum has been a great step towards that direction. Green economy, clean economy, all these aspects have been helpful there. And maybe there should also be like this is like G to G, government to government, and think tanks to think tanks, like the T20 initiative in the G20. So these kind of things, but also even industry to industry. Maybe like when I was in Delhi, I spoke to the embassies of Denmark and Sweden and others to see how they can, as individual member countries, they can work with the Indian industry to develop capabilities. They can sit with the industry and say, these are the regulations, these are the international standards. How do you comply with these? Maybe some of the things you already do. What is the delta? What is the additional efforts you have to take? So these kind of things would go a long way, because then the Indian government would not think of EU as, or the other developed countries as some kind of neo-colonialist kind of powers or something. They'll think, okay, they are our partners. They're taking a lot of effort. And again, I'm not saying that these are not happening. There are a lot of these things happening already, but I think this has to be intensified and also made more visible, and then brought in the FTA negotiations. You do all these things. You also mentioned this in the FTA negotiations, that we are not talking as if we don't know anything about what's happening in India. We are very much part of all these industry level discussions and academic and research discussions and so on. And now we want to bring it up to the FTA level. So I think this kind of instead of directly jumping into the commitments and so on, we have to go the capacity development and helping each other kind of route. And again, it need not be unidirectional. Even there are a lot of state of the art and new kind of innovations happening in India, which can be taken up elsewhere. Like for example, I think in 2021 when I was there, there was the year of millets declared in the FAO. Millets are climate resilient crops, so if you focus more on that, it can be good for the environment, can be good for health and so on. And that's the contribution of India. India has been the biggest player in millets, and they're promoting that and so on. And many in solar, in hydro and so on, also India's taking some leadership efforts. And like International Solar Alliance is again India's brainchild. So I think these kind of efforts where we look at two-way knowledge sharing and information exchange and collaboration, capacity development and so on, that would boost the FTA negotiations a lot if we kind of put all these things together and say that we are helping each other, and we are at the same level or same platform. So I think that's very important.
Well, these are good advices to negotiators, I think, and I think there is a growing awareness of the need for dialogue and try to sit down and explain and take the time, both when it comes to CBAM and the deforestation regulations, so that it is implemented in a way that is feasible for all partners. One other area where India is very active on the international scene, obviously, is agriculture. And WTO, we know it has problems right now, not only because of the dispute settlement mechanism, even if that is, of course, very serious, but also the difficulties of coming to decisions overall in issues that matters to member states. And one is is agriculture. There's been going on for a very long time agriculture discussions. They are complicated at WTO. They are also complicated on the national level with reforms. We in Europe, we saw massive demonstrations earlier this spring on the streets by European farmers. Some were upset about the new regulations for the greening. Others were worried about trade competition, etc. And I know you had protests in India as well, and we saw them in Japan, in Mexico, all over the world. But when it comes to negotiations in WTO, it seems like India has particular difficulties on agreeing there. What would be, of course, not going into all the details because this is very complex matter, but is there a willingness from India to actually come to an agreement in the WTO, or does it consider that it's better without it?
You want to take it up, Badri, or me? If I think broadly, I don't think India would like to have a multilateral platform for discussion, no doubt about it. And India, in the beginning of the Doha round, India was very active in many areas. Now, the entire WTO negotiations now are largely out of the WTO framework into a plurilateral framework, right? Within the plurilateral framework, I think when the trade facilitation happened, so what happens is that when a country like India goes and negotiates, it is always like, what you bring back home to actually tell to your vote bank, and whether it is after or the WTO negotiation. So when the trade facilitation was clubbed with food security and a package, it's not like we became food secure overnight. When it didn't make any changes to the system, but it was a very interesting way of kind of selling the trade facilitation. And I don't think there is a domestic denial of trade facilitation, but something like that, where there are many areas where there is a strong interest from the Indian industry. And one of the area I can talk very frankly with you is because I'm working on a paper. The Indian industry has a very strong interest in not having a moratorium on the electronic commerce. The reason for this is threefold. One is the definition is not clear what is in the scope and coverage. India is a large ITS exporter. India has already reduced tariff into the importer, so that it's not like it's making real money out of the import duties. And the bigger issue for the industry is that, if everybody starts imposing moratorium, this is not the right route. Let's go for the digital taxation route. Having said that the industry, the only thing they ask for in the WTO is the moratorium. India still is opposing it in the WTO. That's where I think probably the interesting part comes. And that is not because it is trying to oppose it, but probably it is trying to use the moratorium as a carrot to get something in return, and not sure what that something in return is. And probably in the entire process of getting something in return, the entire way of the work program, in which was a multilateral thing only in e-commerce, right, which didn't move forward beyond the WEPC, kind of collapsed. And we didn't join the JSI, and JSI came up with a text. Of course, Americans also did not join the JSI. Indonesia also didn't sign in for the text. So there are countries which are outside. But having said that, the problem that has happened now, and that is where many experts are suggesting, is that we don't join any plurilaterals where China should be there. So there is a bit of a confusion. The second thing is, if we agree to this, what do we get in return? This entire concept of what do we get in return, and just to showcase a return, is sometimes making making it very, very difficult to take a position. Which or even, but it's more like an opposition rather than being a silent spectator as well.
Yeah, but on the moratorium, I mean, there are lots of studies showing that small companies, especially led by women on the countryside, would benefit a lot from this, and this goes for India also, of course. But this concept of what do we get in return, is that where the agricultural policy comes in as well, Buddy?
I think, yes, I've done a lot of work on this e-commerce moratorium, and on this micro, small, and medium enterprises. And I agree with what you said that, they have been, the moratorium has been helpful for the small players, particularly because they are able to take advantage of the global innovations in digital sector, and they're able to make use of them for their marketing and all kinds of things, right? So, but definitely, and also India being a big digital player, some policy certainty globally would help our India's industry to be a good exporter, to continue to be a leading exporter. So, like Arpita said, moratorium actually makes sense for the Indian industry, both large and small. For the large industry, bigger ICT industries and so on, it's more from the export side. There can be policy stability and certainty. For the smaller entities, it's more like from the import side, so that we can avail the best available global technologies, digital technologies. So there is no doubt about it. And as far as I can see, I can say that for sure, that moratorium has been helpful. But the reason why we look at each part of the WTO, like fishery subsidies, is another thing, right? So each of them, we look at each of them with a very careful lens, and then uh, but we also compare or weigh against the domestic interest. What is like, if you take fishery subsidies, for example, there is no direct relevance for India when it comes to this overfishing subsidies and so on. If India, it would have been easy for India to agree to that, saying that, okay, this anyway we are not into this, and this way we can avoid exploitation by other countries, and which can actually help Indian fishermen who are largely small, who are not supported. There are not many subsidies for them, and so on. But still, India hasn't been taking a very decisive step on approach on that, because generally, again, this also boils down to the previous point I was making, where there is a little bit of a perception issue that anything that comes in a multilateral forum, we first uh, think about it in a bit of like a suspicion, as it, like, how is it going to affect our domestic players. And also there is also a long standing uh, tradition, or some kind of continuity in terms of the stances that India takes in many things. So changing that is not a purely political game. It's more of a whole ecosystem. The whole bureaucracy has certain ways of functioning, and it's difficult to change it overnight. So there are certain norms, and people involved in negotiations, they want to comply with that. They want to make sure that they are acceptable in the domestic scene. So that is one reason why India doesn't change a lot of its traditional stances, and food security and others. And food security is much more complicated. I'm talking about fisheries and so on, which are less complicated. Food security is much more complicated because of the domestic stuff. You also mentioned about the farmer protests in India. It was way more violent and intensive compared to in many other countries. And so India had to withdraw those reforms, and with those reforms India could have been closer to this. And many of these WTO and other multilateral international forum discussions rely a lot on domestic reforms, and that domestic reforms, again, India is probably similar to or more complicated than the EU, despite the fact that EU is just a union of countries. India is a union of states, but still the state governments are quite independent in many ways. Many political parties running the states, so it's very difficult to find that cohesion and come up with a consensus on what should be done in terms of agricultural policy in India, which is kind of coherent or congruent with what is being discussed in the WTO and so on. So that is why we go with the status quo. That this is what we have always been saying. Let's continue that until all the other problems are resolved. And I also, bargaining chip is another thing. Like
Yeah.
one being used to, like, another, like the trade facilitation example that Arpita gave, or the moratorium and so on. So that's also another thing, so that we keep all the lines active, and then we keep leveraging one over the other to make sure that our domestic interests are taken care of.
well, as WTO has not been able to agree on much lately, I think something is wrong in the system. And if we want to achieve multilateral solution, I think both pure. I mean, we also need to look at the bigger good, even if one country doesn't specifically gain from this. Also showing the willingness to achieve something that is good for everyone. So, and that probably goes for a lot of partners as well. We have received a question which you have partly answered, but I want to read it out anyway. Good evening from India. I want to ask India's trade potential in the medium term. Learning from the past, the depression in the 1980s, India's trade prospects were similarly at an advantage, but as recovery followed, the India advantage waned. To both the speakers. You have touched a little bit upon it in the beginning, but this is also looking forward a bit, which is an appropriate way to end our discussion.
You
So
start.
basically,
Okay.
Would you start, Arpita? Yeah.
Basically, when you look at India's trade potential, India seems to be on a very high growth trajectory. You know, we have doubled the growth rate of the global growth rate, and if you look at the latest WTO data, we are also doing quite good in terms of exports. Now, exports in India, maybe some of my contemporaries as well, they think that, you know, we should only export and not import, and that's where the problem of all this trade means, that when your trade is growing and you're a growing economy, your imports also grow. So that's growth of import is not bad, is probably something that we need to work on. Secondly, even if the trade is working, exports are diversifying. One of the core issues is that our share in the global trade is not showing a big change in the goods, like we are hovering around 2%, and that's probably an area of concern for the trade economists, and they are thinking, you know, why is it not happening? Maybe we are exporting more of new things, and maybe we are not doing so well in the traditional sectors like textiles and apparels and stuff like that. So there is a need for a targeted thought process about why the share hasn't really changed. We spoke about services, right? India is a big player. We are doing well in services, but the entire services basket is not actually services. It is IT and ITES services. So it's a subcomponent and business services. That is what we are exporting. So, and too dependent on certain markets like the US, maybe 60% or 50%, whichever is the share. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that when you are talking about a long-term, mid-term growth, you first need to have an export strategy document or a vision roadmap. And that roadmap is probably something that India needs now. Like, how do India see its export growth? How do India sees its trade partners evolving over the years, and how does India see it itself growing with the trade agreement? Until we have that kind of a vision document or mission plan, as of now, the strategies look a bit sporadic to whoever is looking from the outside. We go and sign trade agreement. The moment we sign a trade agreement, we are a high tariff country. We reduce the tariff, and everybody says that we have not gained. So, you know, there has to be some kind of a roadmap and mapping. And I think this question probably is talking towards that point, that we need a vision document for the trade, for the medium and the long term.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Badri?
On that, and also there's a lot of domestic initiatives like this production linked incentives and so on to boost the scale in India, which is going towards promoting exports in India. So the medium term outlook from there is definitely positive. We're going to see a lot of increase in exports. The recently concluded FTAs also are providing some room, but like Arpita said, we have to look at a longer term vision. A lot of tariffs are still high in India. So if you want to rationalize that, we call this inverted duty structure is a often used term in India, where the tariffs are high for inputs. So that can be reduced, And like some of these rationalization things, if you do them, you can actually see a lot of boost in exports. And we are also engaging with other platforms like this India, Middle East, Europe corridor, IMEC corridor. Currently, I'm doing research on that with another colleague, Sriram from World Bank, where we are looking at what could be the economic effect of these kind of initiatives on boosting India's competitiveness in the global market and exporting, and increasing India's export share has been one of the stated goal by the Prime Minister himself. Doubling the export shares in India is a goal, but how do we achieve that is another thing. And of course, we have been developing a vision for 2047, 100 years of independence. There, all these things are part of these things, and at some point these will be discussed more in the public domain, and definitely there is a need for having clarity on where do we want to be there in the next few years, and and what's the roadmap for that. So right now it's a combination of many such initiatives here and there. How do we put all that together and see how are we going to achieve that goal, and what is the goal? So these are the things that are still going on.
Super interesting. There are so many more things I wanted to discuss with you on trade with China and Russia and the BRICS cooperation, but we're at the hour. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think there's scope to follow up to discuss this further. Badri Narayan Gopala Krishnan, I hope I got that right. Arpita Mukherjee, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and knowledge with us, and also Badri going up at a ghastly hour. And to you who have watched, thank you for joining us. Have a nice afternoon and evening.
Thank you
Thank you
very much.
Cecilia.
Thank you so much.